everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Alpha Omega. This series goes over a brief history of the past and present locomotive with the lowest number, and then those with the highest number. Today, we'll be focusing on one of two Class 1s on the East Coast, CSX. This episode will be a bit longer when compared to the last one since it involves a wide variety of 4 alphas and 2 omegas, along with the reasoning behind determining an alpha and omega, as well as some honorable mentions at the end. So without further ado, let's begin. Considering that almost the entire road freight engine roster is comprised of various GE wide cabs, it's more than fitting that our first Ultimate Alpha goes to one of the first of such engines, specifically AC4400 CW number 1. Although this engine wasn't technically the first wide cab on the roster, it was the first AC traction-powered variant for the railroad, and one of the first of 2,800 AC traction-powered variants for the Dash 9 in the world, as the AC stood for AC traction power, 44 for 4,400 horsepower, C for the C-C wheel arrangement, and W for wide cab. Built in June of 1994 as a prototype for the railroad, the engine was initially numbered 9100 in the batch of 14 engines that ran throughout the CSX system. These engines were so successful that they were promptly renumbered to 1 through 14, as CSX later ordered another 600 AC44s, including number 404, but that's another video. It's also at this time where the engine would be given the iconic lightning bolt under the number on the cab, representing that the engine uses AC traction power. Based on the immediate success of number 1 and its siblings, the AC4400CW would set a precedent for most new wide cab engines, as AC traction power was preferable to DC power due to increased adhesion, less maintenance, and less time needed to start moving the train. Another feature of the AC44 was the use of steerable trucks, as number 1 was one of 3 engines under number 201 to be modified with these new trucks just 3 years after being built. Seeing that this was the first of hundreds of engines that powered most road freights on CSX, specifically on long coal hauls in the Appalachian Mountains, number 1 was named Spirit of West Virginia around 2002, as part of the road Spirit of series with 5 other AC44s. Since then, the engine was seen traversing the entire CSX system, leading a variety of all kinds of freight trains as a slightly different wide cab in the sea of thousands, as the engine was later repainted into the YM3 paint scheme in 2017 in order to keep somewhat up to date. However, the first AC44 on CSX was finally renumbered to 173 to make way for our next Ultimate Alpha, as the fabled engine was finally rebuilt into an AC4400CWM, with the M standing for modified, and was renumbered to 7274 as part of a rebuild program to modify and extend the lives of older GE wide cabs. Even though this engine wasn't built as an Ultimate Alpha, nor does it retain its number 1 today, it's more than fitting to start off the episode with an engine that wore the lowest number on the roster with pride for most of its life, as the first of a legendary class of engines that set the standard of the freight locomotive industry. Since AC4400CW number 1 was rebuilt and renumbered, this leaves AC4400CW number 4 as the Ultimate Alpha for revenue service on the current roster, as number 4 was not renumbered or rebuilt as of when this video was made, and still traverses the CSX system with the same story as number 1, albeit without the steerable trucks or Spirit of name. Now some of you might be wondering, what happened to numbers 2 and 3? They, along with number 1, were renumbered when CSX reassigned those numbers to 3 recently repainted special interest units, specifically F40PHRs number 1, 2, and 3. Obviously, this new number 1 is the Ultimate Alpha on the present-day roster, so this is the specific engine we'll focus on, even though the other 2 F40s have a similar history. Number 1 was initially built in April of 1978 as Amtrak F40PHR number 280, with F standing for full body cowl unit, 40 for 4,000 horsepower, P for passenger, H for head end power, and R indicating that it was rebuilt using parts from traded-in SDP-40Fs. Like the previously mentioned number 1, 280 was one member of a common type of engine that was exceptionally good at its job, as the F40 is praised as the engine that saved passenger rail due to its reliability and iconic representation of Amtrak. 280 also served the entirety of the system of the railroad it worked for, as it initially started running Chicago-based air city services like the Illinois Zephyr and Blackhawk, and then moving to long-distance services such as the Texas Eagle and Cardinal, before ending up with the remaining F40s on New England and upstate New York service until their retirement in 2002. Faced with a surplus of their most iconic engines, Amtrak ended up selling many of their F40s to museums and short lines for tourist and freight work respectively, as 280 along with 288 were sold to the Ohio Central Railroad in 2005, where they worked with other ex-Amtrak F40s by hauling local freights, a task they were also great at since they were essentially passenger variants of the GP40, an equally successful freight engine. About a year later, 280 and 288 were purchased by CSX, where they were painted in their YN3 livery in number 9998 and 9999 respectively. The two engines would join two more F40s acquired years earlier, namely 9992 and 9993, where they would carry countless office car specials ranging from one car to over 20, once again fulfilling their intended purpose of passenger service, albeit this time carrying corporate executives in the freight railroad. Over time, some of the OCS coaches would be repainted in the Baltimore and Ohio inspired liveries until the decision was made to have the OCS engines themselves match the coaches. Finally, in 2021, 9998 was repainted into an authentic B&O livery reminiscent of their early E units, as it was given CSX lettering and renumbered to 1, while numbers 2 and 3 were repainted from 9993 and 9992 respectively. To this day, number 1 and the other F40s continue to pull various office car specials throughout the CSX system, and bringing much delight to rail fans as these legendary F40s continue to fulfill their purpose as reliable mixed-use engines as a new but worthy engine to wear to number 1 as a present-day Ultimate Alpha. Even though the present-day Alpha is an OCS unit, there are technically two other Ultimate Alphas on the current roster that also share the number 1, and you'd be surprised as to what these engines are. The first of these Ultimate Alphas is HLS-1, a former Seaboard Line SD45-2 that's used for load tests at the CSX Huntington shops that has its own livery variant. But this is where my explanation of this Alpha ends, since Cal Unit Productions already made an in-depth video on this engine in particular, and I don't want to upload redundant content or to take away his spotlight, so feel free to watch his video and subscribe to his channel. The other number 1 on the active roster comes from the most unlikely location, as that honor goes to narrow gauge GE 55 tonner number 1 at the Toledo ore docks. You heard that right, CSX rosters narrow gauge engines that are still used to this day, and they're also technically the last CSX engine still wearing the original YN1 livery to this day, as was covered in an early episode of Train Facts. Number 1, along with the other 9 field pushers and pig pushers, were initially built by the Chesapeake and Ohio Road, where they would move coal cars from a nearby yard to a rotary car dumper, as they were later acquired by the Chesney system and then CSX. But oddly enough, this doorport operates as a subsidiary of CSX, as they roster SC40s in CSX colors, but with TORC lettering, representing Toledo Ore Dock, and even though few photos exist of number 1 and the 55 tonners, it's still a surprise to know that this mysterious narrow gauge field pusher shunter holds the title of the Ultimate Alpha that sees revenue freight service on the current CSX roster. Now, the journey to determine the Ultimate O'Mega in our picture archives is an even harder one than determining the Ultimate Alpha, as I had to navigate through multiple retired slugs and work engines to find the current Ultimate O'Mega that's in revenue freight service. Thankfully, based on a recent renumbering of a certain engine back in late 2022, the title now goes to C40-8 number 9280, as it's a rare example of an engine being bought back by its original purchaser and being renumbered accordingly. Specifically, 9280 was initially built in August of 1990 as number 7627 towards the end of a 147-unit order of the GE C40-8, with the C standing for C-C wheel arrangement, 40 for 4,000 horsepower, and -8 standing for the decade the model was built in, even though this specific engine was built just after its namesake decade in 1990. 7627 was also one of the last GE engines to have the standard cab, right as the manufacturer shifted production to the now standard white cabs just a year prior, and it was also one of the first engines to be built in the railroad's iconic YN2 Bright Future livery. Like the rest of the class, 7627 could be found on all kinds of freight trains all across the CSX system, until the class was stored in 2016 as other standard cab GE road engines were either being upgraded with white cabs and new prime movers, or straight up retired. But since most railroads were opting to rebuild older engines instead of purchasing new ones outright in 2010s, older road engines were being purchased by smaller Class 2s and short lines, and 7627 along with 29 other -8s were purchased by the Pan Am Railway, also known as the Guilford or the Maine Central Railway, as they served the country's largest Class 2 on mainline freights from Boston to Maine. Although, most of the acquired C40s were not repainted, as they all kept their original numbers, as 7627 had its CSX lettering initially crossed out with black lines before eventually being patched over, and its nose was eventually painted blue around 2021. But around the same time, Pan Am Railways was in merger discussions with the same railroad that sold them the C40s to begin with, as Pan Am eventually agreed to be purchased by CSX, with operations being transferred in June of 2022. With the acquisition of Pan Am Railways also came the acquisition of their fleet, including the C40-8s that they originally sold, as 7627 emerged from the Huntington shops in August of the same year in a slightly different version of the YN3 livery, with the logo slightly higher to nose, as well as CSX.com lettering on its side, as the engine was renumbered to 9280, since the original 7600 numbering series was taken by the AC4400 CWM rebuilds. From here, the repainted and renumbered C40 was once again roaming around the CSX system and was even used as foreign power on the West Coast, as this is likely the first of many ex-Pan Am C40-8s to be repainted and renumbered. But since 9280 is currently the only engine from the group that was officially renumbered, that currently makes this engine the ultimate O'Mega in revenue service on the present-day CSX roster. Now earlier in the video, I mentioned how F40PHR number 1 was renumbered from 9998, while numbers 2 and 3 were repainted from 9993 and 9992 respectively. Meanwhile, 280 and 288 were renumbered to 9998 and 9999 respectively, so this begs the question, what happened to 9999? Built as Amtrak 288 and having an almost identical history to 280, this F40 is still in its YN3 livery and still holds its number of 9999, thus making this OCS unit the ultimate O'Mega on the current and all-time CSX roster. In addition to hauling various OCS trains with the other 3 F40s before they were repainted and renumbered, 9999 was last seen about a year ago with a 2-car-long OCS on the recently acquired Pan Am Railway track at Jermaine, before being spotted trailing various mixed freights in the Northeast. Likewise, the future of the last remaining YN3 F40 is quite uncertain, as many are wondering if this F40 will be renumbered or repainted into either another B&O inspired livery or another Fallen Heritage livery, a question that's made especially difficult with the debut of the fading Heritage livery on their official Heritage units. But whatever happens next, it's fitting that two great engines that are iconic in not only American railroading, but also in CSX, take up the current Ultimate Alpha and Ultimate O'Mega titles, as 9999 still goes down in history as the Ultimate O'Mega on the all-time and current CSX roster. 3 other honorable mentions for our Ultimate Alpha include ex-Seaboard System H15 number 0001, a rare rebuild of a Seaboard Airline STP-35 which was later renumbered to 1001, Waycross Load Test Unit WL01, originally a Seaboard Coastline U-36B Bicentennial Unit, later Safety Train Unit number 7746, and Track Geometry Car GMS-1, which hasn't been seen since 2014. Although, these were not included in the episode since the first of these was renumbered to something that wasn't the lowest on the roster, WL01 spent the least amount of time as a load test unit and was more well known for other positions, namely as a YN3 Safety Train Unit with a different number, while GMS-1 was simply a maintenance vehicle which has lower priority when compared to a locomotive. That, and I didn't want this episode to run on for too long, especially if certain entries had little to no info on them. Even though this series doesn't have a frequent schedule, I'm still glad I was able to wait this long for this episode, since it gave enough time to determine an Ultimate O'Mega in revenue service. Thank you again for watching. Credit for all the photos used go to their respective photographers, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Have a good day.